Good evening, and welcome to The Price of Power. Tonight, we step quietly into a narrow mountain pass, where on a cold November morning in the year 1315, the ground grew slick with blood, and the waters of Lake Egerie turned dark with the bodies of drowning men. This is not a story of heroes charging into glorious battle. This is a story of farmers and herdsmen who understood something the armored nobility had forgotten: that power, when stretched too thin along a mountain road, becomes fragile as morning ice. As the world around us continues its endless negotiations with authority, as empires rise and fall in boardrooms and parliaments, it is worth remembering that there was a time when power wore steel and rode on horseback, when the very concept of freedom was decided not by votes or treaties, but by whether you could hold a mountain pass against men who believed they owned the earth simply because they had been born to the right family. The Battle of Morgarten is not celebrated in the same breath as Thermopylae or Agincourt. There are no Hollywood films, no sweeping epics that capture the imagination of millions. And yet, on the 15th of November, 1315, something shifted in the deep structure of European power. On that day, approximately 1,500 peasants and townsmen from the Swiss forest cantons faced an army led by Duke Leopold I of Austria. An army that modern historians estimate contained between 2,000 and 9,000 soldiers, many of them heavily armored knights representing the flower of Habsburg military might. What happened in that narrow pass would not merely decide a battle. It would challenge the fundamental assumptions of medieval warfare and accelerate the long, slow death of feudalism itself. But to understand how a handful of mountain dwellers came to slaughter an entire army in less than 2 hours, we must first travel backward through time to a moment when the Alps were not yet a political reality, but rather a collection of valleys where people lived as they had for centuries, raising cattle, clearing forests, and asking very little from the world except to be left alone. As the 13th century drew to a close, the geography of Central Europe was a patchwork of competing powers. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient ghost of Roman authority, stretched across much of what we now call Germany, Austria, and northern Italy. Within this empire, thousands of smaller jurisdictions competed for influence: prince-bishops, free cities, monastic territories, and noble families, all jockeying for position in an endlessly complicated hierarchy of vassalage and alliance. At the heart of the Alps, where the mountains rise like the bones of the earth itself, 3 small valleys had achieved something remarkable. The communities of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, collectively known as the Waldstädt, or forest communities, had received imperial immediacy from the emperors of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. This meant that these valleys owed allegiance directly to the emperor himself, bypassing the usual layers of noble authority that defined medieval life. The reason for this privilege was simple. These valleys controlled access to the Gotthard Pass. The Gotthard Pass, sitting at an elevation of 2,106 meters above sea level, had become, by the 13th century, one of the most important trade routes in Europe. For centuries, the journey through the Alps had been nearly impossible. The northern approach to the pass was blocked by the Schulenen Gorge, a terrifying chasm where the Reuss River carved through sheer rock walls. But around 1,220, someone history does not record exactly who constructed a bridge across the gorge. This bridge, later known as the Devil's Bridge for the seemingly impossible nature of its engineering, transformed the Gotthard from an impassable barrier into a viable trade route. Suddenly, merchants could travel from the wealthy cities of northern Italy, Milan, Genoa, Venice, directly through the Alps to the commercial centers of Germany and the Low Countries. The journey that had once taken months of dangerous mountain travel could now be accomplished in weeks, and every merchant, every pack train, every wagon of goods traveling this route had to pass through the territories of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden. The revenue from tolls and trade transformed these poor mountain valleys into surprisingly wealthy communities. More importantly, it gave them strategic value. The emperors understood that controlling the Gotthard meant controlling one of the vital arteries of European commerce, and so for a time, this arrangement worked. The communities thrived. They developed their own systems of governance, their own courts, their own military traditions. The people who lived in these valleys were free peasants, a rare status in medieval Europe, where most agricultural workers were serfs bound to the land and to noble masters. These Swiss farmers owned their land, they elected their own leaders, they administered justice according to their own customs. They had tasted freedom, and they would not give it up easily. As the 13th century turned into the 14th, the political situation began to shift. The Hohenstaufen dynasty collapsed in a series of succession crises and conflicts with the papacy. When the last Hohenstaufen emperor died in 1254, the empire entered a period historians call the Great Interregnum, a time when rival claimants fought over the imperial crown, and central authority effectively disappeared. Into this power vacuum stepped a family that had been patiently building its power base in the Austrian territories, the House of Habsburg. The Habsburgs were not in 1273, the mighty dynasty we remember from later centuries. They were ambitious nobles from Swabia, clever political operators who understood that land meant power, and power meant more land. When Rudolf I of Habsburg was elected King of the Germans in 1273, he became the nominal head of the Holy Roman Empire. But Rudolf understood that the imperial title was worth less than the territories he could control directly. He looked at the map of Central Europe and saw the Gotthard Pass. He saw the wealthy valleys that controlled it, and he began to move, piece by piece, to bring these territories under Habsburg control. In 1291, Rudolf died. His death marked a turning point. The communities of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, sensing that the political winds were shifting, met in secret on August 1 of that year. The representatives of these three valleys signed a document that would later be known as the Federal Charter of 1291. The charter itself is a modest thing, a single sheet of parchment containing a few paragraphs of Latin text. But its message was revolutionary. The three communities declared that they would form a perpetual defensive alliance. They agreed to mutual military assistance against any external threat. They pledged to maintain their ancient rights and privileges, and they swore that they would recognize no judge who was not from among their own people. In essence, they declared independence, not openly, not with fanfare, but quietly. As a simple matter of fact, they would govern themselves, defend themselves, and owe allegiance to no noble family, no matter how powerful. For the Habsburgs, this was intolerable. Rudolf's son, Albert I, took up his father's ambitions. He moved to assert Habsburg control over the mountain territories, attempting to install his own administrators, demanding taxes and feudal obligations. The Waldstädt resisted. They cited their imperial privileges, their freedom charters granted by previous emperors. Albert ignored these claims. He had the military power to enforce his will, or so he believed. But before Albert could launch a full military campaign against the Swiss valleys, he was assassinated in 1308 by his own nephew, John Parasida, in a dispute over inheritance. Albert died on the banks of the Reuss River, the same river that flowed through the territories he had sought to conquer, struck down by a sword to the head and neck. The Habsburg ambitions did not die with Albert. They passed to his sons, Frederick the Fair and Leopold I. Duke Leopold I of Austria, born around 1290, was a man shaped by the violent politics of his age. He had watched his father build Habsburg power through a combination of strategic marriages, military force, and political maneuvering. He had seen that power threatened by rivals, by papal excommunication, by the resistance of subjects who refused to acknowledge Habsburg authority. When Albert was murdered, Leopold was barely 18 years old, but he was already being groomed for command. The assassination of Albert I set in motion a crisis of succession within the Holy Roman Empire. Multiple candidates claimed the imperial crown. The electoral process broke down into a bitter contest between Frederick the Fair of Habsburg and Louis IV of Bavaria. In 1314, the empire elected two kings simultaneously: Frederick, supported by Habsburg allies, and Louis, backed by the Bavarian faction and the Luxembourg family. This dual election plunged the empire into civil war, and in the chaos of that conflict, the Swiss Confederates saw an opportunity. In 1314, men from the canton of Schwyz raided the abbey of Einsiedeln, a wealthy monastery that lay on the border of their territory. The abbey was under Habsburg protection. The raid was not mere banditry, it was a political statement, a deliberate provocation. The men of Schwyz were asserting their independence, their right to administer justice within their own territory, even against powerful ecclesiastical institutions. The raid on Einsiedeln was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Duke Leopold I, serving as his brother Frederick's military commander in the west, saw the raid as an act of open rebellion that could not be tolerated. If the Habsburgs allowed a group of peasants to attack a monastery with impunity, what message would that send to the other territories within their sphere of influence? Authority, once challenged, must be reasserted with overwhelming force, or it ceases to be authority at all. Leopold began assembling an army. The army Leopold gathered in the autumn of 1315 was, by the standards of the time, a formidable force. Modern historians debate the exact numbers. Medieval chronicles often exaggerate, and record-keeping was inconsistent. The earliest sources speak of thousands, some claiming as many as 20,000 men, though more conservative modern estimates place the army at somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 fighting men, with perhaps another several thousand in support roles. What is not in dispute is that the core of Leopold's force consisted of heavily armoured cavalry knights and men-at-arms drawn from the Austrian territories and from Swabian noble families allied with the Habsburgs. These were professional warriors, men who had trained from childhood in the arts of mounted combat, who wore full suits of plate and chain armour that could weigh 40 to 60 pounds, who carried lances and swords of the finest craftsmanship. Medieval cavalry was not merely a military tool, it was the physical embodiment of the feudal order. The knight, mounted on a powerful warhorse, protected by armour that cost more than a peasant could earn in a lifetime, represented the monopoly on violence that the nobility claimed as their birthright. Knights were, in theory, the defenders of Christendom, the enforcers of law, the protectors of the weak. In practice, they were the mechanism by which a small aristocratic class maintained control over a much larger population of peasants and townspeople who had no military training, no armour, no weapons beyond whatever they could improvise from farming tools. The superiority of cavalry over infantry was one of the foundational assumptions of medieval warfare. Foot soldiers, slow, poorly equipped, easily scattered, were considered little more than cannon fodder, useful for occupying ground or conducting sieges, but utterly incapable of standing against a cavalry charge. When armoured horsemen thundered across a battlefield, infantry formations tended to break and run. It was the natural order of things, reinforced by centuries of military history. Leopold's army also included infantry drawn from the towns under Habsburg control. These would have been better equipped than peasant levies. Many would have had helmets, padded armour, shields, and proper weapons like swords or spears. They would march alongside the cavalry, providing support, occupying territory, ensuring that any victory was complete. The army gathered at the town of Zug, on the northern shore of Lake Egeria, in early November 1315. Leopold's plan was straightforward. He would march south through the mountains into the territory of Schwyz. Once there, his overwhelming military superiority would allow him to occupy the valley, destroy resistance, and install Habsburg authority permanently. The peasants of Schwyz, seeing his army approach, would either submit or be crushed. It was a simple plan, and like many simple plans in military history, it rested on assumptions that had not been tested. The Confederates of Schwyz, Uri, and Unterwalden were not a professional army. They had no cavalry to speak of. Most of their soldiers were farmers and herdsmen who spent more time tending livestock than training for war. They had no suits of plate armour, no fine weapons forged in German smithies. What they had were halberds, axes, clubs, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. The halberd was the weapon that would define Swiss military power for the next 2 centuries. It was not an elegant weapon. It was a polearm, typically about 6 feet long, with a metal head that combined an axe blade, a spike, and a hook. The halberd could be used to thrust like a spear, chop like an axe, or hook an enemy and pull him off balance. It was cheap to produce, simple to learn, and devastatingly effective in the hands of men who knew how to use it. The Swiss had learned, through necessity and experience, that infantry could defeat cavalry if the conditions were right. The key was to control the terrain, to choose ground where horses could not maneuver, where the advantage of mobility that cavalry enjoyed on open ground became a fatal liability. And the Confederates knew exactly where to fight. Between Zug and the valley of Schwyz lay several possible routes. The most direct passed along the eastern shore of Lake Egiri, through a narrow passage beneath the slopes of the Morgarten mountain. This passage was perhaps half a mile wide at its broadest point, hemmed in by the lake on one side and steep forested slopes on the other. There was a road barely more than a track, really, that wound through this constricted space. It was perfect. The Swiss established defensive positions at the other possible approach routes. They built barriers called Letzen, simple fortifications made of logs and stones at the passes through Arth and Rothenthurm, positions that would require a direct assault to break through. But at Morgarten, they left the path open, guarded only by a watchtower in the hamlet of Schornen. It was an invitation, carefully designed to look like an oversight. The Confederates positioned their main force in the forests on the slopes above the Morgarten Pass. They waited. On the night of the 14th of November 1315, Duke Leopold's army left Zug. They marched by moonlight, a risky undertaking, but Leopold wanted to achieve surprise. His scouts had reported that the passes at Arth and Rothenthurm were blocked, but that the road through Morgarten appeared undefended. Leopold made his decision. They would take the Morgarten route. The army began to move through the narrow passage in the early morning hours of November 15. It was still dark when the vanguard entered the defile. The cavalry led the way, as was customary, knights and men-at-arms riding in a long column along the muddy track. Behind them came the infantry, strung out over perhaps a mile or more, a snaking line of torches and banners moving slowly through the mountain darkness. As dawn broke, the column was deep within the pass. The lake glittered to their right. The forested slopes rose steeply to their left. The morning was cold, and clear accounts suggest that the weather was good, the ground not yet frozen, but certainly chilled by the November air. And then the mountain came down on them. The Swiss had positioned themselves on the heights above the pass, concealed in the forest. They had gathered boulders, logs, anything heavy that could be rolled or thrown downslope. When the Habsburg column was strung out along the narrow track, unable to form up, unable to maneuver, the Swiss struck. The first thing the Austrian soldiers would have heard was a sound like thunder, the rumble of hundreds of boulders and logs crashing down through the forest. The slope of the Figlenfluh mountain was steep enough that these objects gained tremendous speed as they fell. When a 200-pound boulder strikes a horse at high velocity, the result is catastrophic. Horses screamed and went down. Men in heavy armor, knocked from their saddles, found themselves pinned beneath their mounts or simply trampled by the chaos. Before the Austrians could process what was happening, the Swiss infantry charged down from the slopes. The Swiss did not fight like conventional infantry. They did not form neat ranks and advance slowly. They came down the mountain in a rushing, coordinated attack. Perhaps 1,000. 300 men from Schwyz, supported by 200 from Uri and more from Unterwalden, a total force that most historians place around 1,500 to 2,000 fighters. They wielded their halberds with brutal efficiency. A halberd's axe blade could cleave through the lighter armor joints under the arm, at the neck, behind the knee where even plate armor was vulnerable. The hook could pull a rider from his saddle, sending him crashing to the ground where he could be finished with a thrust from the spike. The Swiss had trained for exactly this kind of fighting, where the advantage lay not with the heavily armored knight, but with the nimble footman who could strike quickly and move before the knight could bring his greater strength to bear. The Habsburg cavalry, trapped in the narrow pass with the lake on one side and the slopes on the other, could not charge. They could not form up. They could not use their lances effectively. The most expensive military assets of the medieval world, armored knights on war horses, became simply targets, struggling to stay mounted, struggling to see who was attacking them from every direction. The battle was not a glorious clash of armies, it was a slaughter. Contemporary accounts, written within a few decades of the battle, describe scenes of utter chaos. Knights who tried to flee toward the lake found themselves bogged down in the marshy ground at the water's edge. Those who stayed on the road were cut down by Swiss halberdiers who showed no mercy and no understanding of the chivalric customs that usually governed warfare between knights. There was no taking of prisoners for ransom, there was no quarter given. The chronicler Johannes von Winterthur, writing in the 1340s, recorded that approximately 1,500 men were killed in the attack, a number that does not include those who drowned in Lake Egeria trying to escape. Other sources suggest that some Austrian foot soldiers, seeing the carnage and recognizing that they had no chance of survival, chose to throw themselves into the lake rather than face the Swiss halberds. The battle, from the first boulder rolling down the slope to the last Austrian soldier fleeing or dying, probably lasted less than 2 hours. By mid-morning, the Morgarten Pass was carpeted with bodies. The Swiss had won a victory so complete, so unexpected, that even they must have been stunned by the scale of what they had accomplished. Duke Leopold, I was not among the dead. He had been riding with the vanguard, but when the attack began, he managed to fight his way clear of the trap. He escaped on horseback, fleeing north back towards Zug, abandoning his army to its fate. The man who would become known as Leopold the Glorious spent the rest of his life living down the shame of Morgarten. In the days following the battle, the Swiss victors went through the wreckage. They collected armor, weapons, horses, spoils of war that represented more wealth than most of these farmers had ever seen. They found the bodies of nobles, men of rank and title, and they buried them in mass graves. Medieval warfare operated on certain unspoken rules. Knights did not slaughter other knights unnecessarily. They took them prisoner, extracted ransom, observed the codes of chivalry. The Swiss, as free peasants not bound by feudal oaths, had no investment in this system. They had not read the rulebook. They had simply destroyed an army that threatened their freedom, using the tools and tactics available to them. As word of the disaster spread through the Habsburg lands, there was shock and disbelief. How could peasants, illiterate farmers with farm tools mounted on poles, have annihilated an army of trained knights? The answer was uncomfortable for the nobility of Europe. The Swiss had won because they had understood something that the feudal military establishment refused to acknowledge: that superiority in battle comes not from expensive armor or noble birth, but from tactical skill, knowledge of terrain, and the will to fight for something that matters. Less than a month after the Battle of Morgarten, on the 9th of December 1315, representatives from the 3 forest cantons met in the town of Brunnen, on the shores of Lake Lucerne. There, they signed a document known as the Pact of Brunnen, formally renewing and expanding the alliance of 1291. The pact was more than a military alliance. It was a statement of political philosophy. The document established that disputes between the cantons would be settled by arbitration, not force. It prohibited any canton from making separate peace with external enemies. It declared that all members would come to the defense of any member under attack. And it used, for the first time in an official document, the term Eidgenossenschaft, literally oath fellowship, the word that would eventually become the German name for Switzerland. The Swiss were declaring, in effect, that they constituted a political entity defined not by feudal loyalty or royal decree, but by voluntary association and mutual obligation. It was a radical idea, one that would take centuries to fully mature, but the seeds were planted in the aftermath of Morgarten. The victory at Morgarten did not end Habsburg ambitions in Switzerland. It merely postponed them. Duke Leopold I survived the disaster and continued to serve his brother Frederick in the ongoing civil war against Louis of Bavaria. In 1322, Frederick was captured at the Battle of Mühldorf, and Leopold spent years attempting to secure his brother's release. Leopold himself died in 1326, at the age of about 36, possibly from heart disease. He was buried at Königsfelden Abbey in Switzerland, a location chosen perhaps as a reminder of Habsburg claims to territory they had never managed to fully control. The Confederates, emboldened by their victory, began to expand their alliance. In 1332, the city of Lucerne joined the Confederation. In 1351, Zurich entered the alliance. Glarus and Zug followed in 1352. Bern, the largest and most powerful city in the region, joined in 1353. The Confederation was growing, transforming from a defensive pact between three mountain valleys into a significant political and military force. This expansion alarmed the Habsburgs and other noble families who saw their power and lands threatened by the growth of what they viewed as a peasant republic. In 1386, Duke Leopold III of Austria, grandson of Leopold, I assembled another army to crush the Swiss once and for all. He led his forces into a battle at Sempach, in the territory of Lucerne. Once again, Swiss infantry armed with halberds faced Habsburg cavalry. Once again, the Swiss won. Duke Leopold III was killed in the fighting, his skull reportedly split by a halberd blow. The death of another Duke Leopold in battle against the Swiss must have seemed like a curse to the Habsburg family. The Swiss victory at Sempach was followed by another triumph at Nefels in 1388. The pattern was clear: Swiss infantry, fighting on favourable terrain, using their long pole weapons with devastating efficiency, could defeat any knightly army sent against them. The military balance in Central Europe was shifting, and the old feudal order was beginning to understand that its monopoly on military power was breaking down. But victory came with a cost. The Swiss Confederacy, having tasted success, began to change. The humble peasants who had fought at Morgarten gave way, over generations, to professional soldiers. Swiss mercenaries, men from the mountain cantons who hired themselves out to foreign powers, became the most sought-after fighting men in Europe. They fought for the French kings, for the Holy Roman emperors, for the Italian city-states. They fought for money, and they were very good at what they did. By the late 15th century, Swiss pike squares, formations of infantry armed with 18-foot-long pikes, supported by halberdiers, were considered nearly invincible. They marched across European battlefields with a reputation for discipline and ferocity. Their battle cry, "Verfault, verfault," literally, "rotten, rotten," was feared from Burgundy to Italy. They fought in the Burgundian Wars, where they destroyed the army of Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, in a series of battles that left Burgundy as a shattered state. They fought in the Italian Wars, where they became entangled in the endless conflicts between France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Italian states. But success bred arrogance, and arrogance bred defeat. In 1515, exactly 200 years after Morgarten, a Swiss army hired by Pope Leo X marched into northern Italy to fight the French. At the Battle of Marignano, they faced a French army equipped with heavy artillery. For 2 days, the Swiss pike squares attacked French positions, and for 2 days they were blown apart by cannon fire. Thousands of Swiss soldiers died, cut down not by cavalry or opposing infantry, but by technology they could not match. Marignano broke the myth of Swiss invincibility. After Marignano, the Swiss Confederacy made a collective decision. They would no longer fight wars of expansion. They would defend their own territory, but they would not march into foreign lands for conquest or glory. This decision, codified in various treaties and agreements, became the foundation of Swiss neutrality, a principle that would define Switzerland for the next 500 years. But neutrality did not mean pacifism. Swiss men continued to serve as mercenaries throughout Europe, most famously in the Swiss Guard at the Vatican, established in 1506 and still active today. The Swiss Guard, with their distinctive Renaissance uniforms and ceremonial halberds, are the last living connection to the tradition that began at Morgarten. When you see a Swiss Guard standing watch at St. Peter's Basilica, holding a halberd identical in design to those wielded in 1315, you are seeing history made visible, a direct line connecting the present to that cold November morning in the Alps. The Battle of Morgarten has been celebrated in Swiss national mythology since the 16th century. The earliest formal commemorations date to the 14th century. Johannes von Winterthur records that the people of Schwyz decided to hold a yearly memorial service. In 1501, a chapel was built at the site of the battle. Every year, on November 15, Swiss citizens gather at this chapel to remember the battle. There are speeches, processions, people dressed in medieval costume, target shooting competitions. It is a national holiday in some cantons, a day to reflect on Swiss independence and the sacrifices that made it possible. But the mythology of Morgarten is complicated. Modern historians approach the battle with appropriate caution. The numbers cited in medieval sources are almost certainly exaggerated chronicles from that era, routinely inflated casualty figures for dramatic effect. Archaeological investigations at the site have found limited physical evidence, leading some scholars to suggest that the battle may have been smaller in scale than traditionally believed, perhaps even a large skirmish rather than a major engagement. Yet the historical impact of Morgarten cannot be dismissed. Whether 1,000, 500 or 5,000 men died in that pass, the political consequences were real. The battle solidified the Swiss Confederacy at a moment when it might have dissolved. It demonstrated that new tactics and new forms of military organization could challenge the established order. It encouraged other territories to join the Confederation, leading to the expansion that would eventually create Switzerland as we know it today. The battle also marked a turning point in medieval warfare. Morgarten was not the only battle where infantry defeated cavalry. The Flemish had achieved a similar victory at Courtrai in 1302, and the Scots would triumph at Bannockburn in 1314. But Morgarten was perhaps the most psychologically devastating because it involved not skilled urban militias or rebel nobles, but simple farmers. If peasants could slaughter knights, what did that say about the natural order of medieval society? The answer, of course, was that the natural order was not as natural as the nobility liked to believe. Power, the Swiss had proven, was not a birthright. It was something that had to be constantly maintained, constantly defended, constantly renegotiated. The Habsburgs learned this lesson slowly. They would not formally recognize Swiss independence until 1499, after yet another war that ended in their defeat. Even then, it would take until 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War, for the rest of Europe to formally acknowledge that Switzerland was a sovereign entity, not subject to imperial authority. The long arc from 1315 to 1648 is a story of gradual transformation from a defensive alliance of mountain valleys to a recognized nation-state. It is a story of how military success, combined with political cohesion and a strong sense of shared identity, can transform a collection of disparate communities into something more permanent. But it is also a story about the limits of military power. The Swiss won at Morgarten, at Sempach, at Naples, and in dozens of smaller engagements. They proved themselves to be formidable soldiers, yet they never conquered an empire. They never imposed their will on their neighbors through force of arms. Instead, they turned inward, developing their unique political structures, the Confederation of Cantons, each maintaining significant autonomy while cooperating on matters of common concern. This system was messy, inefficient, and prone to internal conflicts. The Reformation, when it arrived in the 16th century, split the Swiss cantons along religious lines, leading to internal wars between Catholic and Protestant territories. The centralization that characterized most European states, the development of royal bureaucracies, standing armies, unified legal codes, came slowly to Switzerland. If at all, the Swiss remained, in many ways, stubbornly medieval, clinging to local autonomy and traditional rights long after these concepts had been swept away elsewhere. And yet, this very stubbornness became a source of strength. While other European nations exhausted themselves in wars of religion, dynastic succession struggles, and imperial expansion, Switzerland remained mostly at peace. Swiss mercenaries fought in foreign armies, but Swiss territory remained inviolate. The country became prosperous, not through conquest, but through trade, banking, and manufacturing. The lessons of Morgarten, that security comes not from aggression but from making yourself too difficult to conquer, became embedded in the national consciousness. Today, Switzerland is known for neutrality, for diplomacy, for being the place where international organizations establish their headquarters and where peace negotiations are conducted. The International Red Cross, the United Nations office at Geneva, the World Economic Forum at Davos. All of these institutions exist in Switzerland because Switzerland has spent centuries cultivating a reputation for impartiality, but the mythology of Morgarten is complicated. Modern historians approach the battle with appropriate caution. The numbers cited in medieval sources are almost certainly exaggerated chronicles from that era, routinely inflated casualty figures for dramatic effect. Archaeological investigations at the site have found limited physical evidence, leading some scholars to suggest that the battle may have been smaller in scale than traditionally believed, perhaps even a large skirmish rather than a major engagement. Yet the historical impact of Morgarten cannot be dismissed. Whether 1,000, 500, or 5,000 men died in that pass, the political consequences were real. The battle solidified the Swiss Confederacy at a moment when it might have dissolved. It demonstrated that new tactics and new forms of military organization could challenge the established order. It encouraged other territories to join the Confederation, leading to the expansion that would eventually create Switzerland as we know it today. The battle also marked a turning point in medieval warfare. Morgarten was not the only battle where infantry defeated cavalry. The Flemish had achieved a similar victory at Courtrai in 1302, and the Scots would triumph at Bannockburn in 1314. But Morgarten was perhaps the most psychologically devastating, because it involved not skilled urban militias or rebel nobles, but simple farmers. If peasants could slaughter knights, what did that say about the natural order of medieval society? The answer, of course, was that the natural order was not as natural as the nobility liked to believe. Power, the Swiss had proven, was not a birthright. It was something that had to be constantly maintained, constantly defended, constantly renegotiated. The Habsburgs learned this lesson slowly. They would not formally recognize Swiss independence until 1499, after yet another war that ended in their defeat. Even then, it would take until 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War, for the rest of Europe to formally acknowledge that Switzerland was a sovereign entity, not subject to imperial authority. The long arc from 1315 to 1648 is a story of gradual transformation, from a defensive alliance of mountain valleys to a recognized nation-state. It is a story of how military success, combined with political cohesion and a strong sense of shared identity, can transform a collection of disparate communities into something more permanent. But it is also a story about the limits of military power. The Swiss won at Morgarten, at Sempach, at Naples, and in dozens of smaller engagements. They proved themselves to be formidable soldiers, yet they never conquered an empire. They never imposed their will on their neighbors through force of arms. Instead, they turned inward, developing their unique political structures, the Confederation of Cantons, each maintaining significant autonomy while cooperating on matters of common concern. This system was messy, inefficient, and prone to internal conflicts. The Reformation, when it arrived in the 16th century, split the Swiss cantons along religious lines, leading to internal wars between Catholic and Protestant territories. The centralization that characterized most European states, the development of royal bureaucracies, standing armies, unified legal codes, came slowly to Switzerland, if at all. The Swiss remained, in many ways, stubbornly medieval, clinging to local autonomy and traditional rights long after these concepts had been swept away elsewhere. And yet, this very stubbornness became a source of strength. While other European nations exhausted themselves in wars of religion, dynastic succession struggles, and imperial expansion, Switzerland remained mostly at peace. Swiss mercenaries fought in foreign armies, but Swiss territory remained inviolate. The country became prosperous, not through conquest, but through trade, banking, and manufacturing. The lessons of Morgarten, that security comes not from aggression but from making yourself too difficult to conquer, became embedded in the national consciousness. Today, Switzerland is known for neutrality, for diplomacy, for being the place where international organizations establish their headquarters and where peace negotiations are conducted. The International Red Cross, the United Nations Office at Geneva, the World Economic Forum at Davos. All of these institutions exist in Switzerland because Switzerland has spent centuries cultivating a reputation for impartiality and reliability.